Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to start now. So this is a California uh, fire science seminar series, and my name is Viron. I'll be the host for today. I'm a member of the student committee who assisted with organizing the entire California Fire Science Seminar Series. I'm a second year PhD student at Stanford University studying indigenous fire and its socio-ecological effects. The California Fire Science Seminar Series is organized and supported by the California Fire Science Consortium, the Fire Research Group, the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of California, Merced. The student committee was also integral to the success of the seminar series, which included 12 students and postdocs from across the nation who helped select speakers and topics for the series. And before we start, this webinar will be recorded and will be posted on the California Fire Science Consortium website and the YouTube channel. And following today's presentation, there will be a Q&A session. So please feel free to add any question you have to the Q&A chat throughout the presentation, and we'll go through them. So without further ado, today's seminar, After the Fire, Biodiversity on a Burning Planet, will be presented by Dr. Morgan Tingley. Dr. Tingley joined the faculty at the University of California, Los Angeles in 2022, after previously serving as an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut. He holds a PhD in environmental science, policy, and management from the University of California, Berkeley. He is also a recipient of the Wings Across America's Conservation Award from the U.S. Forest Service and is currently the president-elect of the American Ornithological Society. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Morgan Tingley.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you all for joining for the seminar. Uh, I'm going to be talking about fire, and I know that's typical of this group. I do want to acknowledge that even though I'm talking about biodiversity responses to fire, that we all, presumably, actually many of us, if not all of us, live in California or places that burn, and fire impacts all of us. This is actually the view outside of my window about a year ago, looking west towards the Palisades fire. Those flames are burning on the horizon about 500 feet tall. And we did not have to evacuate our house, but it was dicey. It was a really scary time. And as a fire ecologist, it kind of brought a lot of the sort of the reality of everything home, literally home, to thinking about sort of like what it's like to live in these landscapes, in addition to studying the impacts of fire. And part of what's going on, the background that I'm not going to be really talking about is that how fire is changing in California and how there's a lot of different causes that are giving rise to that. This is really one of my sort of a great classic paper. This is a version of that paper of sort of a graphic that was recreated from John Abatzoglu's work at UC Merced and Park Williams, who is now at UCLA with me. And so John and Park had this paper showing how in California, like we would have more wildfires even without climate change, but climate change is making it about 2 times worse. And this is leading to a topic that I think is not unfamiliar to this audience, which is that fire regimes are changing. And so when I'm talking about fire regimes, I'm talking about severity within fires and across all the fires burning on the landscape. I'm talking about the frequency with which fires occur. I'm talking about the science with the size of fires, and I'm talking about the seasonality of fires. And so all of these things are changing in the landscape in California and shifting away from historical norms. And so my talk today is about how biodiversity, really focusing on birds, because that's really one of my major foci for my research, how birds respond to fire. And mostly I'm going to be talking about 2 parts about how birds respond to fire. One is how birds respond during fire, and the other is how birds respond after fire. These are two very different questions, and most of my talk is actually going to be in the second half about how birds respond after fire. But how birds respond during fire is really, really interesting and generally actually poorly known. This is sort of something that has not really been studied until relatively recently. Uh, and I think part of that is because the expectation is that everything kind of dies more or less during fire, if it's if it's in the immediate process of the fire scar. This kind of grisly photo is a photo that was taken in Australia. This is a rainbow lorikeet, a very colorful parrot. And so this is a photo taken in January 2020 during Australia's sort of record-breaking black summer, right before the pandemic hit. And so this is a rainbow lorikeet that is on a beach, washed ashore with a lot of different, with sort of post-fire debris. And so this is a bird that probably actually did not burn from the flames. It flew away, undoubtedly to escape. It might have actually flown out over the ocean to escape the burning eucalypt forests, but it likely asphyxiated in the smoke and then was fell into the ocean and was washed ashore on the beach. Which leads to this actually bigger question of what happens during fire, how animals respond to fire. And that's not just the issue of there's not just a concern about fire itself, but about all the smoke. And so smoke is something that is, I think, starting to have a better, greater recognition of its broad impacts. One of the turning points for me was actually relatively recently. I've been studying fire for over 20 years now, but smoke for only about 5 or 6. And I was flying. This was August of 2021. I was flying back down to Los Angeles from the Pacific Northwest, and like you're flying throughout Washington, and you're seeing all the beautiful mountains and volcanoes, and it's clear and beautiful. And we hit the border of Northern California, and it just became this gray blur everywhere. And eventually, sort of looking out to the left in Northern California, you can see the Dixie Fire, which is that's this big smoke plume here on in this photo. This is the Dixie Fire, which burned over 1 million acres through 5 different counties of Northern California in 2021. And Dixie, in addition to a lot of other fires that were burning at the time, just made this huge sea of gray. And so when we think about fire impacts, and particularly what happens during fires or even after fires, even though there's a lot of fire in California, this is just in fire in the United States, this is just a photo of kind of all the active fires that were occurring last August. And all these red dots are active fires, including things like prescribed fire, but still a lot of fire. Each of these fires are still like, even though there's a lot of them and they have large impacts on the landscape, they still have really defined areas. Whereas like smoke goes everywhere. This is the same day, just showing where all the smoke was in North America. And so obviously where there's fire, there's smoke, but also where there's no fire, there's also smoke. And so smoke can have really, really long-ranging impacts across communities where there is no fire as well. And so where I'm starting to appreciate sort of the way that we have these really broad teleconnections of fire across continents, across really, really large landscapes, not because of the fire itself, but because of the smoke that's produced. And as I said, smoke is like a really poorly understood topic. A former postdoc of mine, Olivia Sanderfoot, published really this amazing review article that if you're interested in this topic, I encourage you to check it out. Is published in 2021. And it's just a review of kind of everything we know about smoke's impact on the ecology of animals. And what the hypotheses like basically is summarized in this slide showing how smoke can lead to short-term habitat changes. It can add particulate matter, it can add gases. This can lead to health effects, behavioral responses, all of which could impact survival, reproductive success, or growth and development, which essentially can lead up to population level impacts. Well, this is an incredible framework for essentially establishing our hypotheses about how species might respond to smoke. One of the conclusions of this article is that there's like a lot of hypotheses, but very little data. Uh, and it's something that people are starting to kind of wake up to that this might be an issue, but it's a frontier of science right now is actually understanding smoke impacts in small to large scales. One of the other things that kind of led to this realization that smoke might be a big issue was what happened actually back in September of 2020. This was a sort of a mass mortality event of birds that occurred mostly in New Mexico in September. And if were in California at the time, you'll remember that there was huge amounts of fires that started in like July and August of 2020, particularly a series of like, I think it was like 400 fires that started in California over one 24-hour period in August of 2020 because of thunderstorms and lightning strikes. Uh, but by September, there's this massive mortality event where just tons and tons of birds that were kind of migratory or pre-migratory just fell out of the sky, and people found them just dying or dead out in perfectly natural areas. Uh, they did autopsies and found that these birds did not die of gas inhalation. That is to say, they didn't actually asphyxiate in the air. But the best hypothesis right now is that actually the smoke likely forced them to migrate early or move away from really key stopover and staging areas where they were gaining food and gaining body mass. Moved them into places where there's less food, like New Mexico, which is very dry in September, and there's not a lot of food. And then they had a cold snap, and they didn't have essentially the food reservoirs to actually survive it. And so they basically all starved to death because of being displaced, likely by wildfire smoke. There's another great study that came out in 2021 by Corey Overton, who's at USGS in the Central Valley. And in the Central Valley, they actually have a great long-term studying where they've been putting GPS trackers on a lot of big waterfowl, including these Thule white-fronted geese that migrate every summer up to Alaska where they breed. And so they spend their summers up in Alaska, and then the falls they migrate back down in flocks, V's, and they make their way down across a few stopover sites. They're kind of traveling more or less together quite neatly. They go to a place in Southern Oregon called Summer Lake, where they spend about a week to kind of refuel before they make the final voyage down to the Central Valley, where they then spend the rest of their entire winter. This is what a migration looks like in a normal fall. In 2020, it was not a normal fall. As I said, there was smoke everywhere. There was a lot of fires happening, and the migration took a really different route. And so this was an opportunistic study that Corey was able to do because he just happened to be tracking these birds at that time. But these yellow tracks are the tracks of individual birds, and you can see that they're going all over the place. Like the flock has broken up. This one individual hangs out, basically gets super lost, hangs out on the Idaho-Washington border for like a week, just kind of like trying to hang out and get enough food to continue, for the smoke to dissipate. They have these GPS trackers also were able to track their altitude. And so when the flock first hit the smoke, they were over the Gulf of Alaska. And the first thing they tried to do is actually fly over the smoke. So they gained tons and tons of altitude to try and go over it. Unable to go over it, they basically go through it. They also found that basically they would tire out a lot. They would just like sit on the ocean and just raft to regain energy to meet before going on. Some of the geese did not make it. It was a huge disruption, but it could be something that is a type of disruption that is increasing in frequency. My lab was able to collaborate with the San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory based out of the South Bay. Great group. If any of you ever go down to SFBBO, they have a long-term banding station there just west of San Jose. And we were collaborating with them to look at their banding data on birds from a really, really long time frame. And what we looked at, one of the things that was cool with this data set is because they're banding every week or multiple times a week during the entire summer and fall, which is the season in which there's smoke, which a lot of bird banders, a lot of ornithologists don't work then. And so we were able to actually look at individual birds. And when ornithologists capture birds in nets to measure them and to band them, they will always take their body mass. And so we could look at the body mass of birds at their first capture and then their body mass of birds at a recapture. So we could actually individual level changes in body mass. And then we started to look at what happened when birds were actually experiencing smoke from wildfires in between those captures. And what we found that basically was that the increasing number of days with which there is PM 2.5 over 35 micrograms per liter, which is like really not a lot of smoke in the air. It's a pretty low threshold. It's an EPA threshold for humans. Birds should be more sensitive. When they had more exposure to smoke, they would lose their body mass. So, and probably they are decreasing their activity, but they're also decreasing their foraging and their food. There actually might be less food on the landscape. A lot of these birds are insectivores. And so they were losing their body mass during this time. And so, with 10 days of relatively minor amounts of smoke, their body mass would decline by almost 2%, which for birds that are kind of always living on the edge, the knife's edge of sort of starving to death, it's this is something that is potentially worrisome that could lead to demographic consequences. But as I said, like we don't know a lot about smoke in general, and so one of the things that I've done with a former postdoc of mine, Olivia Sanderfoot, who's now with Cornell, and the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County, is that we've banded together to create a community science program that uses the platform eBird, where we have birders in California, and actually now Oregon and Washington as well, who every year, starting in July through November, are doing weekly data collection for us, often like in their backyards or something like that. So we can start to actually understand how birds are responding before smoke, during smoke, and after smoke. We started this in 2024 when we had 240 individuals participating. Last year, we had a huge amount of growth in the program. We had over 2,000 individuals collecting weekly data for us for about 5 months. And we hope to continue that trend for 2026. So that's kind of like the end of my section on how birds respond during fire. And this section is really to say, well, we have a lot of questions. We have a lot of questions and not a lot of answers. We know that active flames and heavy smoke can have negative impacts on bird populations and likely other types of animals as well. But this is a really, really hard question to study, and we just don't have a lot of numerical data. It's something that I've been focusing on a lot for the last 3 or 4 years, and we hope to have a lot more coming out in the near future. But it's kind of like a growth area, with an area with a lot of questions and a lot of things for us to learn. So as a scientist, that's exciting. But as like a person with a heart, it's always a little bit demoralizing because usually the stories are not great. So the second part of my talk is how birds respond after fire. And in some ways, actually, after fire is a much more, delightful thing to study, because you get to work in landscapes like this. So this is a photo taken up in Plumas County in Northern California. This is in a fire that is around 9 years post-fire. And we can see how there is a nice mosaic of different types of successional stages on the landscape. There's areas that were burned only with low severity, and so there's still lots of standing conifers that are still green. There's patches that are really heavy, regenerating. There you can see this whitethorn that's about chest high. And this is a landscape that, for an ornithologist, is alive. And one of the species that is most iconic of the Sierra Nevada burned forests, and the reason that I got first into fire science at all, is this species, the blackback woodpecker. So the blackback woodpecker is a species that is found from California north in the boreal zone, across Canada, all the way to parts of northern New Hampshire and Maine. In the western US, particularly the farther south you get, so that is to say, mostly its entire range in California, and also some parts of the Rockies, it's really, really reliant on fire. The extent to which it relies on fire, like would it be entirely lost from our landscapes if we had no fire? That's unclear. But certainly in California and in the Sierras, where it's found, like if you go to fires, you will find it. If you don't go to fires, it is very hard to find. And one of the reasons it likes fires so much is because it's food. And this is kind of the story about how a lot of birds first come into fires after a landscape burns, is because it's this huge buffet of food. And so here we can see an adult female blackback woodpecker who's feeding her young this giant juicy grub that's magnified in the photo on the lower right. And this is a grub of a wood-boring beetle of the family Buprestidae or Cerambycidae. These are the beetles that bore into these trees following fire right after the trees have died. And for the first 10 years or so after fire, particularly after severe fire, where there's a lot of dead trees, there's just this huge amount of food. And the blackback woodpeckers come into these landscapes to take advantage of it. Because blackback woodpeckers are so characteristic of these landscapes, we started working in a research project that began in 2009 to study how blackback woodpeckers were distributed across the state. And so this was a collaboration that I helped be involved with for its length. It was funded through the Forest Service. It was a collaboration between the Forest Service and an NGO based out of Northern California called the Institute for Bird Populations. And so this was a monitoring program that ran from 2009 till 2024. And every year we selected a panel, a rotating panel of 50 different fires in the state, in the Sierra Nevadas, that had burned within the previous 10 years. So over this 15-year time period for the program, we worked in over 150 different fires. In each of these fires, we surveyed 20 different sampling points. So we have over 3,000 survey points. We were doing both broadcast surveys for the woodpeckers and all bird point counts as well. We found over 2,400 woodpecker detections and over 150 different bird species. And you can see that like it's a really cool database because like we have fires all the way up to the Oregon border and all the way down to the southernmost extents of the Sierras. And of course, like the reason that we're doing this research is to try and get patterns like this, which is like, okay, how is the population changing from year to year? How's the proportion of occupied sites changing? Is the population stable? Are these post-fire habitats relatively constant and stable across the landscape? And we could see that while there's sort of year-to-year fluctuations in how many blackback woodpeckers are on the landscape, the population has seemed to be pretty stable, which is not all that surprising given that essentially fire is more or less constant on our landscapes. If you look at any given fire, though, you actually see a pretty strong downward trajectory. So these blackback woodpeckers are really, really abundant or relatively easy to find in the first 4 to 5-ish years after fire. And then starting around 5 years after fire, they actually decline pretty steeply. And so by 10 years after fire, less than, maybe about 30% of sites actually still retain the woodpeckers. And if you go to 20 years after fire, as other researchers have done in California, it's really, really hard to find black-backed woodpeckers still in those areas. There's just the habitat has changed so much and the food has kind of disappeared. And so they've moved on or they've died out and the territories haven't been reclaimed. And so this phenomenon, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you, is that the time since fire is the most important factor governing colonization and persistence at both the patch scale and the local scale, at least for this species. But because of this phenomenon that it took us a while to figure this out. It's kind of what we suspected, but we needed to prove it. Uh, Once we figured this out, that we could predict where blackback woodpeckers would be space and time based almost purely on a single factor, which is how many years it had been since fire, we started to think more about like, well, what's the species biology and what's governing this? And so one of the things we did was we went into these different fires, and we went into a suite of fires of different ages, number of years post-fire, and we caught all these different blackback woodpeckers, and we then aged the woodpeckers. So to say, okay, you're in a 2-year-old fire, how old are you? And so, if this is like a crash course in bird aging, if you've never done it, it's really hard. And it's pretty much all based off of feather patterning. And so ornithologists study how the patterns, like really fine scale patternation changes. Also, birds go through once or twice a year this feather replacement process called molt. And you can look at how the patterns of molt have changed across the wing. And if you're kind of a savant, like Peter Pyle is, who did a lot of this research, who we collaborated with, you can actually start to age birds into different age classes based off of patterns of molt and plumage. So that's what we did with these blackback woodpeckers. We were able to capture them and say, okay, are you in your second year of your life, your third year of life, your after third year of life, your fourth year of life, or your after fourth year of life, right? So it's that's bird talk, but we can get five age classes for these adult type birds. And then we were able to say, okay, of these age classes, how old is the fire itself? How many years post fire? And we found like a really quite strong relationship. Again, time since fire is really important for the species. And so that young fires had young birds. Like a first year fire would have mostly second year birds. That is to say, they are in their first full year of life and it's their first time breeding. So their first time establishing territories. Uh, and then like 8 year fires would have mostly birds that were at least 5 years old, if not older. And so this relationship suggested to us that like, okay, young fires have young birds, old fires have old birds. This is presumably a metapopulation system that is driven by juvenile dispersal. So the idea here is that juveniles are that young are born, they go off to form territories, and our hypothesis was that they probably are leaving the fire they were born in and going off and finding other fires. Really, really cool idea, like a mechanism that would support a metapopulation, but something that like is really hard to prove. In order to try and to do that, we actually had to go out and capture juveniles. Capturing juvenile woodpeckers is not easy because really the best time to get them is when they're in their nests. And you don't want to put GPS trackers or radio harnesses on them when they are babies. So you have to find a nest, you have to then monitor the nest, and then a day or two before they are about to fledge or leave the nest, you have to go up to the nest cavity and you have to take the woodpeckers out and you have to put little harnesses on them so that you can track them with radio. And then you put them back in their hole and say, okay, go off and voyage tomorrow when you leave the nest. Of course, this is even harder working in burned landscapes because you can't actually put a ladder up against these trees because the ladder might actually cause the tree to fall and then to destroy the nest. So we had to come up with a mechanism by which we could actually essentially hold ladders up purely vertical without actually putting any weight on the tree. But some of these nests were quite high, as you can see in this photo. So we ended up using four different belay lines, which is actually a method someone had come up previously for accessing bird nests. And these four different belay lines would hold up these ladders quite stably. We took a lot of safety precautions, but it would hold this ladder up perfectly vertical so that it would not actually have to touch the tree. And then not me, thankfully, but my former PhD student, Andrew Stillman, would climb up this ladder with a lot of safety precautions, access the nest, pull out the woodpeckers, measure them, put the harnesses on them, and then let them go on their way. And then that meant that we had all these adorable little baby blackback woodpeckers, like you can see on the left here, that are wandering across the landscape with radio antennae going off of their backs. And so we could follow them for their first year of life. The first few months, they are actually dependent, after they leave the nest, they're still dependent on their parents. Their parents are teaching them how to forage. You can see that their beaks are not fully big enough yet to really get a lot of the food. And so their parents are teaching them how to forage for themselves and bring them food. But then in the fall, they basically start to really explore the landscape. So Andrew is out there on the landscape running around with a radio antenna or driving around in the landscape. And then eventually they start to go even farther. And so we actually have to go up into ultralight planes fixed with radio antennae and fly circles and circles and circles around Northern California, trying to re-find these baby woodpeckers who are off exploring the world. But what we get really cool data on where they go. The sample size is not huge. We lose a lot of birds, both to predation, which I'll get to, and also just they are never seen again. And that could be because they actually have left the whole study area. That's one of our suspicions. But we do have at least data on 19 birds, where they were born and where they finally moved to. Of those 19 birds that we tracked, 7 out of 19 left the fire that they were born in and moved to a different fire. So these are just two examples of what that looks like. This is a bird that was born in this fire. We could not find it in the fall. It had moved someplace else. But by the following spring, where it was breeding and it established a territory and had a nest with a mate, it had moved to a different fire. In the lower example here, this is a bird that basically was born in one fire, in the fall had moved to a second fire, and by the following spring had moved to a third fire, skipping across the landscape from fire to fire. We have 4 out of 19 birds that actually left the fire they were born in and basically moved and settled and built nests in unburned forest. Unburned does not mean undisturbed. In almost all of these cases, they're actually small or big patches of beetle killed forest where there were a fair amount of dead trees that could provide food. But still, this is the minority on the landscape, particularly given actually how much beetle killed forest there was on the landscape at this time. And then 8 out of 19 settled in the same fire that they were born in. Here's an example of an individual that was born in a fire. In the fall, it had left the fire and was off in the landscape exploring, but by the following spring had returned to a different portion of the same fire. We tracked juveniles up to 50 kilometers from where they were born, which is pretty cool. Many individuals cannot be relocated. There is 100% likely we calculated 100% likelihood of birds leaving the fire if the fire they were born in was greater than 3 years old, which is really, really interesting. Again, the importance of time since fire in this landscape, that if they were born in a fire that was like 4 years old or 5 years old, they would not stay. They would go off and find some other habitat to then breed in. And they also traveled farther if they were born in an older fire. So the older the fire they were born in, the farther they would go. We asked, do they seek fire? Well, 78% of woodpeckers settled in a burned forest. If we actually did a lot of really complex simulations about where they could go on the landscape, the random expectation based out of those simulations is that they would only settle in burned forest 10% of the time if they were not choosing fire. And so their conclusion there is that yes, they are actually choosing and searching for fire on the landscape. And in particular, they are looking for fires that seem to be younger. So birds that are born in one fire, almost all of them actually moved into fires that were younger than the fire they were born in. So if they were born in a fire that was over 3 years old, there's a 100% chance they'll leave it. And then there's a very good chance that when they leave it, they will end up finding a fire that is younger, and that's the one that they will settle in. So there's something special about fire, and I think maybe that is not a lesson that is lost on this audience, but it's a lesson that I find is something that it's really important for me to communicate to a lot of the audiences that I'm talking to about. And this is a lesson that is not just about birds and fire, and not just about woodpeckers and fire, but it's about the whole ecology of post-fire landscapes. And so another part of this research that I've been working on for the last decade or so is about what fire's role is on the landscape in the context of diversity. And a lot of this theory that is based around this goes back to like fundamental, foundational ecological thinking in the context of biodiversity, which is this idea that diversity begets biodiversity. So if you go back to sort of foundational ecological papers like MacArthur and MacArthur, 1961, they're looking in different parts of the world. They're looking at how many bird species there are in one plot, and then relating it to actually what is the diversity of the vegetation in that area, not the number of species of the vegetation, but what is the actual structural diversity in terms of strata. And they found that in areas that were more structurally diverse, they would find more bird species. So diversity begets biodiversity. At the same time, foundational ecological work, we have Connell, 1978, who is defining the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, right? And so this is the idea that if you have how disturbances impact the landscape, if the disturbances are too frequent, or it's too early after, or if the disturbances are too large, then you will lose diversity. But if the disturbances are too infrequent, if it's too long after, or if the disturbances are too small, then you'll get this climax community where also you'll have lower diversity. And that there is a peak in diversity when you actually are in the middle. It's like this Goldilocks phenomenon that you can maximize diversity when you have this sort of mixed amount of disturbance on the landscape. And so that has given rise to the idea of pyrodiversity. So pyrodiversity is defined as the temporal or structural diversity of fire. I often think of it, and I often am using it and quantifying it, at least for birds, in the context of structural diversity. But people do measure it for temporal diversity. But the structural diversity of a fire, in terms of its power diversity, often comes from the temporal process by how a fire burns. And so I like to use the Rim fire here as an example. The Rim fire burned in 2013, 250,000 acres. At the time, it was the largest fire ever that had burned in the Sierra Nevada. That's now been surpassed by a wide variety of other fires. But the Rim fire started on August 17th, 2013, at this purple dot here, right outside of Yosemite National Park. And on the 19th, it burned south a good bit, making this yellow blob. But then the winds shifted, and the weather shifted. It got windy, it got dry. And on the 21st, it has this huge explosion to the northeast, where it becomes this huge, raging high severity fire that we're all kind of familiar with now. It's burning through the canopy. It's just like it's expanding super, super rapidly. And that really rapid expanse, that fast, hot fire expanse, leads to high severity fire. So if we then go now to this is basal area loss in terms of fire severity, we can see very easily how when the fire really expanded and became a fast, high severity fire, it then also led to this type of pattern on the landscape. And so pyrodiversity looks at the patterns and the spatial patterns by which we have different types of severity on landscapes and how they are spatially arranged. And so we can think of pyrodiversity as something as a characteristic or trait of individual fires. So we have high biodiversity fires here and sort of at the top where you have mixture of patches and low biodiversity fires here at the bottom where you have these huge high severity patches with not as much variation. We can also think of biodiversity as a characteristic of individual patches within a fire. So you can have a patch that essentially is all low severity or all high severity that both would be characterized as low biodiversity, or areas where you have this mixed severity fire across the landscape and mixture of patches, which would be high severity or high biodiversity. As I said, the scientists and I've been working with other people. This is a paper that Zach Steele led that we published 3 years ago in Journal Biogeography. Biodiversity's been around for about 15 years and people have been studying it in different ways. And so different scientists have kind of come up with different measurements and different ways to think about it. And so what we've tried to do is to bring some sort of synthesis to the study of biodiversity by trying to actually give a framework that is founded in theory. And so we can think of, this is just a summary of multiple ways of thinking about biodiversity, both as spatial, aspatial, or as a kind of a multiple attribute functional diversity approach. And thinking about it both within fires, which is this top row, or across fires, which is this bottom row, and how we can think about this both in context of time since fire and also burn severity. All of these are different aspects of diversity that we can then combine together to consider biodiversity. Gavin Jones and I did a sort of a big sort of meta-analysis type of review paper that we published in 2022, looking at all the evidence for biodiversity begetting biodiversity. So people trying to actually explicitly test whether or not biodiversity was good for diversity writ large. This research, we will credit Australia with inventing this topic and really doing a lot of the foundational work. And it's where this hypothesis has been tested the most. North America is catching up. And then there's just really, it's like the really poor geographic coverage of trying to evaluate this in other parts of the world. So particularly if you are in this audience and you have biodiversity data in other parts of the world, pretty much anywhere other than North America or Australia, I encourage you to test the biodiversity hypothesis because we just need more data points from other parts of this world. You can see that really it's picked up around 2008, 2010, where people have started to study this. And there's been mixed results. Definitely the strongest results are actually in forests. The weakest results are in shrublands, including coastal chaparral systems, and then mixed results in grassland and savannas. My interpretation of this is that as you lead to actually more structurally complex climax, vegetation communities, that is where you're going to have stronger pyrodiversity, biodiversity impacts. And if you only have essentially a single, if you have sort of lower diversity, more lower structural diversity vegetation systems, then probably biodiversity is going to have a lower impact on the landscape. With our work in California and the Sierra Nevadas, one of the first things I published on this topic was back in 2016, looking at how we did find biodiversity higher in biodiverse areas of the Sierra Nevada. And in this case, biodiversity was measured as severity, basically diverse structural diversity and severity layers within fires or across fires. And interestingly enough, we just didn't find that biodiversity relationship 1 year after fire, but it strengthened over time. So by 10 years after fire, these kind of communities, these different burn severities had gone off on different successional pathways that would lead to their own distinct bird communities, leading to overall greater species richness. And one of the things that I've become interested in is that we know that this pattern exists, this biodiversity biodiversity relationship, but we've been trying to figure out, well, what are the mechanisms behind it? And so we can think about like one of the basic mechanisms is kind of boring. It's this idea of habitat complementarity combining with resource partitioning of species, leading to biodiversity results. And so we can imagine that in a basically like a low severity patch where the entire canopy is intact, we can find a nice canopy breeding bird like this western tanager. And in a high severity patch where there's lots of burn trees, we'll find a woodpecker that's exploiting all that dead wood, like this Lewis's woodpecker. And so then all what happens in these highly biodiverse areas is that these habitats come together. You have different species with resource partitioning. And so therefore, at this edge of this severity, you actually get higher biodiversity. And so that certainly is one mechanism that is greatly at play. But one of the stories that's been really interesting and kind of the final story I'll tell on this webinar is how this biodiversity relationship also matters for blackback woodpeckers. And so one of the questions we were thinking about is like, well, we know this is a fire-loving species. We know this is a species that is really most abundant in the first 5 years after fire. Like, how does it respond to biodiversity? And does it have any sort of biodiverse relationships? And so one of the first things we did, and this is with a former PhD student of mine, is we actually collected all of our nest monitoring data. So we had data on 118 different nests of blackback woodpeckers that we'd been monitoring. And we looked at a whole variety of different factors that determine where the nests are located. And not surprisingly, we found relationships to pretty much all these things. We found that blackback woodpeckers were more likely to build their nests in areas of high burn severity, of high snag density, at intermediate tree diameter, of cavities that were lower on the tree, in cavities that were facing east so that the babies in the nests could take advantage of the warm sunshine in the morning. But the interesting thing is this relationship of distance to edge, which we did not expect. The species at the time when we were studying it, the literature was just saying that the species just requires really, really big patches of high severity fire, and that the bigger the patch, the better. But we found this really interesting relationship is that even though, yeah, they like these patches, they wouldn't nest in the middle of the high severity patches. In fact, basically, there was no chance of them building a nest once you got more than half a kilometer from the edge of low severity or unburned forest. And that most of the nests were pretty much closer to the actual edge of the high severity patch. And this was kind of mind-boggling. This was not something that people had really studied or written about for this species that really was seen just as a high severity fire obligate. So we then started looking not just at the nesting data, but also at the tracking data. And we found that essentially by tracking adults versus tracking the juveniles, the fledglings, they were using radically different habitat. This is examples on the left of the patterns of where we'd actually relocate the individuals across fire severity. And even though this is an adult that is in a different landscape than the fledgling, you can see that in both cases, they're using the edges of fire severity patches. But the fledglings are pretty much spending all of their time in the low or maybe medium severity areas where there's still a lot of live trees. Whereas the adults are spending all their time in the high severity, but they're using the edges, like they're not going in the interiors of these patches. And this was like really cool when we found this. And we're like, what is going on? And there's a few things going on. One is that, the adults are staying near the edges because often they're still feeding the fledglings. And so they're essentially the adults and the offspring will be meeting together at the edges of these habitats. But it wasn't until later that we understood why the juveniles wouldn't go in the high severity at all, because it didn't make any sense. Like that's where the food is. That's where they should be. But when we looked at survival, there's survival related to biodiversity. And in particular, if they went into high severity patches, they died. Not like immediately, but the 35-day survival of these baby blackback woodpeckers was really low. It was around 15% if they spent the majority of their time in high severity fire, where it was a much higher for a bird, 50%, if they spent their time in any other habitat. And the reason that this severity, the reason survival was so low in high severity patches was because they were getting eaten. They were just getting predated on by any predator, particularly avian predator that was out there. Because we were tracking them with transmitters, we could find where these transmitters would end up. And they often ended up in nests of predators like raptors, like hawks, goshawks, falcons. Even we found one in the nest of a western screech owl. And a western screech owl is about the same size, if not smaller, than a blackback woodpecker. But yet, one of these western screech owls was opportunistic and found one of these kind of cumbersome, clown-like baby blackback woodpeckers out fumbling through the world and killed it and brought it back to feed its nest of hungry offspring owlets. So the study by why biodiversity leads to biodiversity in this landscape for this species is not necessarily a question of resource partitioning across species, but really it's the impact of the landscape of fear, essentially how predators are impacting species choices or age class choices on where to spend their time and what habitats to use. And so even though this landscape is absolutely full of food and great, it's a bonanza, it's also really dangerous. If you are not very good at flying, and you're sort of not really with it with the world yet because you just left the nest a few weeks ago, this is a place where you die. This is a place where you get eaten. And so the woodpeckers know that. The adults build their nests close to the edges, and as soon as the young leave the nest, they go straight to that hillside where there's all those live trees where they can just sit there and hide for weeks until they get old enough to actually survive on their own. So the conclusion from this work was that we really have found two different mechanisms for biodiversity relationship. One is this idea of resource partitioning. One is the landscape of fear. And so it's not just about habitat diversity, it's also how species use fires that is inherent to this biodiversity relationship. And one of the takeaways of this is Audubon published talking about some of our research is that like mega fires are not even good for fire-loving birds, right? So blackback woodpeckers are the emblematic species of a fire-loving bird in California, but these huge mega fires that lead to massive high-severity patches don't have nearly as many blackback woodpeckers as they should because these high-severity patches do not appear to be particularly well used by even the species that should be using them. And so, the final conclusion here is that like we know our fire regime is changing, and what we're seeing is we're seeing more bigger high severity patches and bigger fires, less biodiversity on the landscape, even while we're having more fire on the landscape. And so the question is, well, what is the future of biodiversity in Western forests, which is one of the topics that I'm really interested in and what my lab studies, and hopefully you're interested in this as well. With that, I will happily take questions. And thank you for your interest and attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tingley. So we will now open it up for questions. And if you have any question that you haven't put in the Q&A chat, please go ahead and do so now. So we do have one question from Marta. Um, so Dr. Tingley, did you find any indication if the size of the fire changed the dispersal distance or age of the woodpeckers?
Oh, that is a great question. It's such a good question that I actually don't know the answer. I'm sure we looked into it. Part of the problem, well, we don't have a ton of power, right? So we kind of only have the dispersal distance for 19 individuals, and they're pseudo replicated amongst fires. And so right, we know that fire age impacted dispersal distance. Did fire size? I'm got. I know that bigger fires, obviously, they were more likely to actually settle within the fire, so you were less likely to leave the fire if the fire was bigger because there's kind of more space and more territories. But controlling for age, whether or not sizes, I don't know. I'd have to go and look that up. That's a great question.
Thank you. And we have another question from Tian. They said, thanks for the cool talk. In one graph, you show the bird mass increase first and then decrease with the years after fire. And you also mentioned that the birds will choose old burn regions to migrate to. Are these two findings related? And is there a certain threshold range for years after fire that birds tend to choose?
The so I think this is the first uh was what the question is first about. So this is not bird mass. This is bird it's you can think of this as like proportion, yeah, this is the proportion of sites that are occupied. So you can kind of think of this as like abundance. Um, and so this is showing that like right after fire, you actually get, at least the first year after fire, there's, over 70% of these sites that we surveyed had birds, had blackback woodpeckers in them. And then it kind of increases in peaks around year 4, and then it decreases. Uh, and then the question that our estimate, like basically our hypothesis about how the system works temporally, is that decrease happens after year 4, but partly this is due to birds living out their entire lives in one fire. And so our study of the dispersal is that the dispersal is primarily done only by the juveniles. That is to say, you're born, you leave the nest, you disperse once, you go across the landscape, you find a new place to live, presumably a fire. It might be the fire you were born in, but often it's a different fire, and then you establish a territory there. And for the most part, our guess is that you then live there for the rest of your life. These woodpeckers live uh, maybe like 8 years if they're lucky. And so that is kind of also what we see here in this graph, in that you know for the most part you're not like you don't actually find very many of them after 10 years. And so that could just be that like the territories are dying out. The other thing, right, is we found is that like if you're in an old fire, 100% of those juveniles that were born in old fires would leave. And so there's not going to be a lot of local recruitment into the same fire, because of this idea of sort of declining habitat.
All right. Thank you so much. I think that's all the Q&A question we've gotten from the audience. And it is also about time, so we'll wrap up today's webinar. And I want to thank everyone for joining, and a special thanks again to Dr. Morgan Tingley for their enlightening presentation. Our next session is scheduled for March 20th at noon, and we'll be discussing Indigenous fire stewardship, eco-cultural research for wildlife resilience in California and beyond with Dr. Melinda Adams. So before we sign off, please keep an eye out for the webinar evaluation that will be sent out soon. And thanks everyone once again. We really look forward to seeing you all in our future sessions. Have a great day.
Thank you.